The morning Tessa Harlow nearly got herself fired, and somehow ended up with a ring on her finger and a mother-in-law who would have walked through fire for her. Started with a spilled coffee and a man who had absolutely no business looking that calm about it. She'd been running late. Not fashionably late. Not even excusably late. The kind of late where you're already composing your apology text while still in the elevator, where your blazer is half-buttoned and your lanyard is dangling from your teeth because your hands are full. Tessa had been coordinating events at Lakeview Convention Centre in downtown Toronto for 3 years, and she had never, not once, missed a setup window. Until that Tuesday in October. The call had come from her assistant, Bex, at 6:47 in the morning. The delivery crew for the Aldridge Foundation Gala had arrived 2 hours early. The florist was having a breakdown in the freight corridor, and the caterer was claiming nobody had confirmed the service entrance code. Tessa had been in the shower. She'd made it from her apartment in the annex to the convention center in 19 minutes, which was either a personal record or a sign she was becoming unhinged. She didn't see the man until she'd already walked into him, or rather, walked into his coffee. The cup caught the edge of her portfolio binder, flipped neatly, and deposited its entire contents, dark roast, no sugar, very hot, down the front of his white dress shirt. She had half a second to register that the shirt was exceptionally well made before she started talking. "I am so sorry. That was completely my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going. If you give me 2 minutes, I can." "It's fine," he said. She blinked. He was already blotting the shirt with a folded handkerchief, which was such an old-fashioned thing to produce in that moment that Tessa nearly laughed out loud. He looked up at her briefly, dark eyes, no particular expression, and then looked back down at what he was doing. "It's not fine, your shirt is ruined. Let me at least." "I have another one upstairs," he said, with the particular flatness of someone who is accustomed to problem-solving themselves. Upstairs. In the convention center. Tessa didn't have time to process that. Bex was calling again. She said another sorry, meant it, and ran. She didn't think about him for the next 4 hours. The gala setup consumed everything. The florist was eventually talked down. The caterer located the correct entrance code. It had been in his own email the entire time, and by noon the grand ballroom looked exactly as it was supposed to look. White and gold and quietly magnificent. The kind of room that made people feel they'd arrived somewhere that mattered. It was only when her assistant handed her the final walkthrough sheet and said, "The Aldridge team wants to confirm with you directly. They said their contact is a Mr. R. Aldridge. He's already in the building," that Tessa felt something shift in her stomach. She found him in the smaller reception room off the main corridor. He was standing with his back to her, phone to his ear, the ruined white shirt replaced by one that was nearly identical. He turned when he heard her come in, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You're the coordinator," he said. "You're the client," she said. His name was Reid Aldridge. Not just any Aldridge. The Aldridge, the one whose family had quietly funded half of Toronto's arts infrastructure for 2 generations and whose own company, a private equity firm called Aldridge Capital, had made the business section of every major paper in the country at least twice in the past year. He was 38, she would later learn. That afternoon he looked like a man who was used to being the most important person in any room and had simply accepted it as fact, the way you accept gravity. He looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement if it had tried a little harder. "The woman who walked into me this morning," he said, "is running my foundation's largest event of the year. The man whose shirt I ruined," she said, "forgot to mention he was going to be in the building." Something changed in his face then. Not much. Just enough that she noticed. The gala that evening was, by every measurable standard, a success. The speeches ran on time. The lighting was exactly right. The Aldridge Foundation raised more than $2 million for arts education across Ontario, which was a record, and Tessa stood near the back of the room and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of something done well. She was packing up at 11 when Reid Aldridge found her again. "You didn't introduce yourself this morning," he said. "You didn't give me a chance. You just said it was fine." "It wasn't, actually. That was my favorite shirt." She looked at him. "Is this you being charming?" "Apparently not," he said, and for the first time, something in his expression actually shifted into something that might generously be called a smile. "I'm told I need to practice." She laughed. She hadn't meant to. That was October. By December, she had coordinated 2 more events for the Aldridge Foundation, exchanged approximately 240 text messages with Reid Aldridge that started as logistics and gradually became something else entirely, and spent a frankly unreasonable amount of time thinking about a man she had absolutely no business thinking about. He was a client. He was, by the city's general consensus, one of the most eligible men in Toronto. He had an ex-fiancée, a woman named Portia, who appeared in the society pages with the regularity of a scheduled transit update and who had made it quietly and efficiently known in certain circles that she intended to resume what had been paused. Tessa knew all of this because her colleague Mira, who had the instincts of a seasoned investigative journalist and the subtlety of a foghorn, had told her. "He's not for you," Mira had said, not unkindly. "Women like Portia don't let go of men like that." Tessa had smiled and said she wasn't holding on to anything. She believed it at the time. The third event was a private dinner for 40 of the foundation's major donors, held at the Aldridge family's historic property in Rosedale. Tessa had coordinated events at private residences before, but nothing quite like this. The house was the kind of old Toronto money that doesn't announce itself, that simply exists, that has always existed, with high ceilings and Persian rugs worn soft in the centers, and a garden that in October would have been extraordinary, and in December was still, somehow, beautiful. She arrived 2 hours early with her team. The house manager, a composed man named Gerald, showed her through the rooms, and they were deep in a discussion about the positioning of the bar cart when someone said, from the doorway, "You must be the one who's had my son completely distracted for 2 months." Tessa turned. The woman in the doorway was probably in her late 60s, with the bearing of someone who had never once walked into a room without intending to, and silver hair cut close to her face in a way that managed to look both practical and striking. She was wearing reading glasses pushed up on her head, carrying what appeared to be a half-finished cup of tea, and looking at Tessa with an expression of frank, undisguised interest. "I'm Nora Aldridge," she said, "Reid's mother. And you, unless I'm very much mistaken, are Tessa." "Tessa Harlow," Tessa said, and shook her hand. "I'm coordinating this evening. I know what you're doing professionally," Nora said. "I was more curious about the rest of it." She tilted her head slightly. "You have the look of someone who doesn't quite believe she belongs in a room like this." "I belong in any room I've been hired to manage," Tessa said, before she could stop herself. Nora smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached the eyes. "Good answer," she said. "Come find me when you have a moment." The dinner went smoothly. It always went smoothly when Tessa was running it. She had the ability to make the invisible machinery of an event disappear entirely, so that guests experienced only the effortless result. Reid was there, of course, moving through the room with the ease of someone entirely at home, and if he caught her eye more than once across the length of the dining room, that was between the two of them and the Persian rug. It was after, when the last guests had gone and her team was dismantling the floral arrangements and quietly reassembling the room into something that looked as though 40 people hadn't just eaten a 3-course dinner in it, that Nora Aldridge appeared again with 2 cups of tea and sat down across from Tessa at the kitchen table, as though this were simply what they were doing now. "You coordinated the foundation gala in October," Nora said. "I did." Reid came home from that evening in a different mood than he'd left it. Tessa wrapped her hands around the cup. "The event went well. He came home," Nora said carefully, "and told me that a woman had walked into him in the lobby and knocked his coffee clean down his shirt, and then looked him directly in the eye and told him his shirt was ruined and he should let her fix it." She paused. "He said you didn't apologize a second time after the first one." "I apologized twice, actually, but the second time," Nora said, with the air of someone making a precise point, "you were already moving on." She sipped her tea. "Do you have any idea how few people do that? Move on from a mistake instead of dissolving into it?" Tessa didn't have an answer for that. "Portia," Nora said, after a moment, the name landing with the neutrality of someone who has chosen their words with great care, "is a perfectly accomplished person. She and Reid were engaged for 14 months. She is charming, she is connected, and she treats every room she enters as a room that was waiting specifically for her arrival." She set down her cup. "She also spent those 14 months systematically making my son feel that his judgment was slightly below average and that her presence in his life was a corrective measure." Tessa said nothing. "I am telling you this," Nora said. "Not because it's your business, which it isn't yet, but because I want you to understand what I saw when he talked about you." Which was a man who was interested in someone who hadn't the slightest interest in being impressive. "I was just apologizing for his shirt," Tessa said. "Exactly," said Nora, and smiled again. January arrived, and with it a complication that Tessa had not accounted for. Her events company, not the convention center, but the small independent firm she'd been building on the side for 2 years, Harlow Events, which was just her and Bex and a rotating cast of contracted staff, was in trouble. Not catastrophic trouble, not yet, but the kind that arrives quietly and then isn't quiet anymore. A major client had pulled a contract over a dispute that had nothing to do with her work and everything to do with a change in their corporate direction, and the gap it left in her projected revenue for the first quarter was significant. She was managing. She always managed, but the margin was thin. It was also in January that the Aldridge Foundation called to discuss a considerably larger engagement. The Foundation's Spring Symposium, 3 days, 400 guests, multiple venues, the kind of event that would be transformative for a firm of Harlow Events' size. Reid was not the one who made the initial call. His foundation director, a brisk woman named Lucinda, outlined the scope and the timeline, and said the foundation was speaking to 3 firms. Tessa put together the best proposal she had ever written. She spent 9 days on it. She submitted it and told herself, very firmly, that whatever happened next had nothing to do with Reid Aldridge personally. 2 days later, Portia called her, not emailed. Called. Tessa didn't know how she had her number, and the realization that someone had gone to the effort of finding it sat uneasily. Portia's voice was warm and pleasant and very precise. She said that she'd heard Tessa was being considered for the symposium contract, and that she wanted to be transparent. She had a professional relationship with several of the foundation's board members, and she simply wanted Tessa to know that a conflict of interest had been flagged regarding one of the bidding firms. She did not say which firm. She did not need to. "I'm sure your work is wonderful," Portia said, with the particular warmth of someone for whom warmth is entirely tactical. "I just thought you'd want to know the landscape." Tessa thanked her and hung up and sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then she called Lucinda and asked, plainly and without preamble, whether there was a conflict of interest concern with her firm's bid. Lucinda sounded surprised. There was no such flag, she said. The board had reviewed all 3 proposals. The decision would be made by the end of the week. 2 days later, she got the contract. She found out what had happened in the way these things usually come out. Sideways, accidentally, through a conversation that wasn't meant to reach her. A board member, speaking to a mutual acquaintance at an industry lunch, had mentioned that someone had attempted to raise a question about one of the bidding coordinators on personal grounds, and that the attempt had been noted and dismissed, and that the board had been rather unimpressed with the effort. She also found out, in the same circuitous way, that Nora Aldridge sat on the foundation's board. Tessa thought about that for a long time. She didn't mention it to Reid. They had, by January, moved into a territory that neither of them had officially named, but that had its own particular geography. Long conversations that happened by accident and continued by choice, an ease that had developed without either of them trying to develop it, and one evening in the second week of the month when he had walked her to the parking garage after a planning meeting, and then stood there talking for another 40 minutes in the cold, without either of them noticing the temperature, until her assistant had texted, asking if she was all right. "Can I ask you something?" she said one evening. In February, when they were sitting across from each other in a small restaurant near the distillery district that had no tablecloths and very good gnocchi, and no particular significance, except that it was somewhere neither of them had been before. "You can ask," he said. "Why did the engagement end?" He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable. Reid was rarely visibly uncomfortable, but considering. "She told me, at some point in the second year, that she had always assumed I would grow into someone slightly different than the person I was," he said. "Someone with fewer rough edges." She was optimistic about the timeline. Tessa looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't think I had rough edges." "Do you apparently," he said, with a slight twist of his mouth. "I am overly direct, I work too much, I take up too much space in a room, and my opinions are strongly held to the point of being occasionally intractable." He tilted his head. "You've worked with me for 4 months. Does that sound accurate?" Some of it, she said. Which parts? You definitely take up a lot of space in a room. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A real one, not the polished version. And she thought, in that moment, that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd told herself. The spring symposium was in April, and everything that could complicate it did. The catering company had a staffing crisis in the second week of March. The hotel venue for the second night had a water main issue that required emergency rescheduling of the gala dinner. A keynote speaker canceled with 6 days' notice. Tessa handled all of it, methodically and without public drama, and the only person who saw the private reality of those weeks. The 11 p.m. phone calls running contingencies, the spreadsheets, the particular exhaustion of holding everything together, was Reid, who had a tendency to call at unreasonable hours, for reasons that were initially professional, and increasingly were not. You don't have to be calm all the time, he said. At 1:30 in the morning, when she had just finished explaining her revised catering solution with the focused precision of someone who had been awake for 18 hours. I'm not calm, she said. I'm managing Tessa. I know the difference, she said, and then, because she was tired and it was very late and she had stopped editing herself somewhere around midnight. I'm scared I'm going to drop something. I've never had a contract this size. If this goes wrong, it's not just a bad event, it changes things. He was quiet. You're not going to drop anything, he said. You don't know that. I've watched you reroute a gala dinner with 48 hours notice and make it look like it was always going to be that way, he said. I know exactly that. She didn't say anything for a moment. Get some sleep, he said, which was probably the most practical and also the most caring thing anyone had said to her in months. The symposium ran April 9th through 11th. It was, by any measure she could honestly apply, the best event she had ever coordinated. 3 days, 412 attendees, 6 separate programming components. One emergency involving a broken glass panel in the atrium that Bex handled so swiftly that most guests never knew anything had happened. On the final evening, standing in the back of the hall during the closing reception, Tessa felt something she didn't often let herself feel, which was simply, she had done this specific thing, this well. Reid found her at the end of the night, after the last guests had filtered out, and the team was beginning the quiet work of closing everything down. Come outside for a minute, he said. They stood on the steps of the venue, which was a renovated heritage building in the distillery district, and April in Toronto was still cold enough that she could see her breath. I want to tell you something, he said. If it's about the broken atrium panel, it's not about the atrium panel. He turned to look at her directly, and Reid Aldridge was for perhaps the first time in her experience of him, visibly uncertain. It sat strangely on his face, not badly, just unexpectedly. I had a conversation with my mother in January. About the board meeting, he said. She told me she'd been present when someone raised a concern about a potential conflict of interest with one of the bids. She also told me she'd made clear, fairly emphatically, that the concern was without basis and appeared to be motivated by something other than legitimate governance. He paused. She said she would have done the same for any firm in that position. Tessa looked at him. But she also said, he continued, that she had no intention of letting someone use the Foundation's board as a personal tool, particularly against someone she thought rather highly of. He held her gaze. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know what it meant yet. What we were. What are we? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I'd like to find out. If you would. She looked at him for a long time, standing on the steps of a heritage building with her breath in the cold April air, and thought about October, and a cup of coffee, and a man who had said it was fine when it wasn't, and every conversation between then and now that had felt, against all her better planning instincts, like something she hadn't scheduled but absolutely could not have canceled. You still owe me for that shirt, she said. I'll buy you dinner, he said. That's not how it works. Tessa. Yes, she said. I'd like to find out too. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They stood there for another few minutes in the cold, and she thought that this was the thing about beginnings that you never quite anticipated. They so rarely looked like what you expected. Sometimes they looked like a stranger with a ruined shirt and very little visible reaction. In a lobby, on an ordinary Tuesday, when you were already running late and the florist was having a breakdown, and you had absolutely no room in your schedule for anything else. And sometimes, she thought, That was exactly when they were supposed to happen. Nora Aldridge took her to lunch the following week, at a quietly excellent French place on Yorkville Avenue that Tessa was quite certain had a months-long wait list. She didn't ask how Nora had gotten a table on 4 days' notice. She was learning with the Aldridges to accept certain things as given. "I want to be direct with you," Nora said when they had been seated and the menus delivered. "I'd appreciate that," Tessa said. "I like you," Nora said simply. "I liked you when you told me you belonged in any room you'd been hired to manage. I liked you because you didn't perform anything. Not humility, not confidence. You were just exactly what you were." She folded her hands on the table. "My son has spent a long time around people who perform. He has also," she added, with a precision that suggested this was something she had thought about carefully. "Spent a long time believing that what made him difficult was something that needed to be managed rather than simply accepted." Tessa thought about what he had told her in the restaurant. The rough edges, the assessment, the optimistic timeline. "He doesn't seem to me like someone who needs to be managed," she said. "No," Nora agreed. "He needs to be matched." She looked at Tessa over the top of her menu. "I think you might be rather good at that," they ordered. They talked about things that weren't Reid, about the symposium, about Nora's own work on the foundation board, about Toronto in spring, about a renovation Nora was undertaking at the Rosedale house that had revealed, behind a wall on the 3rd floor, a door to a room that appeared on no original blueprint. Tessa found herself laughing more than she'd expected. Nora was funny in the way that people are, when they've stopped needing to impress anyone. Dry, observational, occasionally withering, and entirely warm underneath it. At the end of lunch, when they were putting on their coats, Nora said, "There's one thing I want you to know. About what I did in January. With the board. You don't have to explain it," Tessa said. "I want to." Nora looked at her steadily. "I would have done it regardless of whether you and Reid had any kind of future. I would have done it for any qualified firm in that position. I want you to know that because I don't want you to feel you owe me anything, or that my opinion of you is conditional." Tessa looked at her for a moment. "And what is your opinion of me?" "That you are exactly what you appear to be," Nora said. "Which is rarer than you'd think." They walked out onto Yorkville together, and the day was bright and still cold, the way Toronto sometimes is in late April, when spring has technically arrived but hasn't quite committed. Nora turned toward Bay Street and Tessa turned the other way, and before they separated, Nora said, "Call me Nora, please. The Mrs. Aldridge thing will get old very quickly." Tessa smiled. "Nora," she said. "Much better." Nora put on her sunglasses, said, "I hope we'll be seeing a great deal more of each other," and walked away. And Tessa stood on the pavement for a moment in the April cold, and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Something between gratitude and relief, and the particular warmth of being seen accurately by someone who didn't have to see you at all. Months later, when people asked the story, and people did ask, because the city was smaller than it appeared, and because Reid Aldridge getting quietly, thoroughly happy was the kind of thing that got noticed. Tessa would say it started with a spilled coffee and a man who said it was fine. What she would also say, if pressed, was that it started with a woman who walked into a kitchen with 2 cups of tea and the unnerving ability to see directly through the part you performed and into the part you actually were. "You didn't need to," Tessa told Nora once, months later, on the steps of the Rosedale house, before a dinner that had long since stopped being a client dinner or a formal occasion or anything other than simply where she was on a Sunday evening. "Stand up for me at that board meeting. You didn't even know me." "I knew enough," Nora said. "How?" Nora thought about it for a moment with the air of someone consulting a memory she was fond of. "You walked into my son," she said, apologized once and kept moving. She paused. "Most people don't do that. Most people apologize until the apology becomes about them." She glanced at Tessa sideways. "You seemed like someone who understood that a mistake belongs in the past." Tessa was quiet. "Besides," Nora added, with the particular composure of someone who is about to say something definitive, he smiled differently after October. I hadn't seen that particular smile in years. She opened the front door. "Dinner is at 7. Don't let him talk you into opening the wine before 6. He'll claim it needs to breathe, but really he's just impatient." Tessa laughed and followed her inside, into the warmth and the high ceilings and the worn center of the Persian rug, into the house that had always existed and the life that was slowly and without her entirely planning it, becoming hers.